Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. It is the Friday afternoon, morning, evening, night, or whatever day you choose to listen to us show. You know, if this was radio, it'd be like, this is the Friday afternoon show with Ethan Orfe. But this isn't radio, it's podcast. So whenever you listen to us, here we are. It's a Friday, so you know I'm on the show. And we got a lot of things to go over today. And on the list of said things is going to be a new kind of duo segment. So two segments in one segment, in a sense, where we're talking about one AFC team, one NFC team every two segments. And what we do is we look over their fantasy potential and see just where do we see some people that may end up being some diamonds in the rough. Maybe we're looking too hard in the rough and there really aren't any diamonds. Or maybe we're overlooking some things about some potential star players that may end up having some regression and things like that. So we're just looking at some teams and we're going to go over all 32 teams over the next couple of weeks as we lead into training camp, into more things. And of course, what we have to talk about today, because we don't have to worry about something that used to be a pivotal part of the NFL news cycle and season. We are going to be without preseason this year. So, big news coming out of the NFLPA camp. So, the NFLPA tells players that there will be no preseason games in 2020. The Players Association on Tuesday told its players that there will be 0 preseason games. And NFL Network's Mike Garofalo, Tom Pizzero, and insider Ian Rappaport reported this. Union leadership shared this information with its players during a conference call one day after the league proposed a one-game preseason slate to the union, then followed up with late Monday with an adjusted offer that included 0 preseason games. So at first it came in with 1, and it didn't seem like the players union really enjoyed that. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense, because why play one game if really it doesn't change anything at all? What is the one game going to do? So the NFL and the NFLPA previously had been split on a preseason slate, with the league sticking to a desire to play half of a typical 4-game preseason schedule before, doing this week. The NFLPA told its membership that it's still pushing for a longer ramp-up period for players to physically acclimate to the training camp demands of professional football, and it expects rosters to stay at 80 players per team. The NFL has not yet signed off on the 80-man roster for training camp per Pizzero, and though there was a discussion on giving teams an option to divide the roster, i.e. to 80 active and 10 on standby, the union told players it wanted all teams to follow one rule. The union said that it had a general agreement with the league on the voluntary and high-risk opt-out possibilities, and other general agreement on the compensatory stipend in the event that games are lost due to ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The main economics still need to be hashed out between the two sides, and the details on the great general agreement also need to be finalized, but the two sides have agreed on the concept. Players took to social media on the weekend to publicly push the NFL to move more seriously to consider their desires in discussions on health and safety protocols, which included all but guaranteed the two sides can move on the next set of matters as they aim to establish a foundation for operations in this unprecedented amount of time. So no preseason games this year for 2020. That's what we know for sure. We're still waiting to hear back how the 80-man roster situation is going to hold up, or the whole opting out and high risk opt-outs things as well. I just found this completely fascinating because how many times have we seen somebody in preseason really showcase something that we've never seen before for fantasy? So what I mean is, when have we ever seen something from preseason from a fantasy owner perspective that we're like, wow, this guy might be special and I need to keep him out on my radar? Well, I'll be completely honest. Football fans, they watch preseason because they're addicts. They love football that much to where they watch a few preseason games and they try to stick it out for as long as they can. And if it's like their favorite team, of course, they may watch the first couple and then it kind of teeters off because it's really not the best football that you want to see. And you got to wait and another month. That's most times another month to really get the football itch that you needed all this offseason ago. So now this is foregone. We have the regular season and that's it. So preseason, we won't be able to look and try to find those diamonds in the rough, so to speak, in the back of the depth charts, or guys who may have some potential, or even somebody who is going to be a kick return specialist that we see sometimes here or there. There's always somebody who runs a kickoff back for 90 plus yards in the preseason that really does nothing else for the rest of the year. But we know this already, right? This isn't anything new. So now we have to look ahead. We have to look towards week 1. And I'm looking at week 1 for 2019 right now via NFL Football Reference, or, profootballreference.com. And I was just interested to see what the week 1s look like across the league. So week 1 last year for Green Bay, that played on September 5th, was an interesting one, as Mitchell Trubisky led the game in passing yards with 228. They had Aaron Jones, with 39 rushing yards, and Robinson from Chicago, Allen Robinson, had 102 yards. That game was 10-3, and that was the lowest scoring affair amongst everything else, but just some interesting takeaways. Derrick Henry had almost 100 yards rushing. He had 84. Baker Mayfield threw for 285 in that game, but they only scored 13 points, which is insane. How you throw for 285 yards and only have 13 points to show for it, that is something. And receiving yards, A.J. Brown had 100 in that game. And then we look at Christian McCaffrey against the L.A. Rams in that first game. Cam Newton had 239 yards. Christian McCaffrey rushed for 128 and he received for 81 yards. So that alone is pretty insane. And if going further down the line, you just start to see some bigger numbers across the board. But typically, star players perform well any given Sunday, but sometimes we got to remember that just because they weren't the top performing across the board for the week 1s and weeks prior doesn't mean that their impact is any less, and that doesn't mean that you need to jump ship or find the guy who's going to produce the most. Because if we look at who were the top wide receivers and top rushers from week 1 of last year, 2019, there are some interesting statistics, really more on the wide receiver the wide receiver side of things than the rushing side of things. And we'll talk about the passers as well. But for wide receivers, the top wide receivers in week 1 of 2019 were Sammy Watkins, John Ross, Michael Gallup, Deshaun Jackson, and Marquise Brown. Now, I remember the Marquise Brown game. People lost their minds. He only caught the ball 4 times, but he had 147 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was a big time performance, but it was against Miami. Miami at the start of the season looked like the worst team we've ever seen touch football. Then we get Philadelphia, where they played against Washington. Deshaun Jackson was a man that he showed some flashes of what he used to be. He had 8 receptions for 154 yards, 2 touchdowns. And then he kind of went down in production from that point on. It wasn't like this was a consistent thing that we saw out of Deshaun Jackson. Then Michael Gallup, who had a really good year, solid year for himself, and he really started off with a bang. No touchdowns, but he had 7 receptions for 158 yards. And that's a big time number. If you're playing PPR, that's about 22 points. That's really solid for a wide receiver number 2. And then we have John Ross, who is probably the biggest outlier out of this whole thing. Like, we don't really know what John Ross will ever become in the NFL, but we always know that he's a speed demon, and that's what he came in known as. But he was hurt for the beginning of his career, and now it's kind of, where do you see him? Is he even a capable wide receiver? Can he play the position? Things like that. But he had 7 receptions for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. And this is why I tell people about Cincinnati and to potentially hold the phone, right? Hold the phone on Cincinnati as far as a team that looks to be rebuilding and retooling and getting new faces around the franchise. I am not saying that Cincinnati is going to come out and be a playoff team. I don't believe that. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, don't be surprised if the Cincinnati Bengals are not as bad as people think they might end up being because of what they performed like near the tail end of the season last year in the middle. Because I do believe that injuries really just took that team to another place and they had to figure something out. Andy Dalton wasn't somebody who they saw for their future anymore. And they took it upon themselves to realize, you know what? It's time to retool. But there's still pieces here that we have that we're not just going to get rid of. And you'll be able to see it later next year, I feel. And it's going to shock a lot of people that Cincinnati is actually going to be a lot better than what we think they are. Of course, it all kind of boils down to how good Joe Burrow, gets accustomed to the NFL level of play and defenses and things like that. But I have faith that Joe Burrow will find success in his rookie year. And I think that the team will be really, really set up for years to come as a young team that has a lot of talent around them and a lot of potential and a lot of upside. And I think when teams have a lot of upside and potential and it's going to trend upwards, they typically show it in the very beginning stages. And it's not always just, we're going to go 3-13 and then we're going to go 4-12 and then maybe we'll go 6-10, and then we talk about potential. No, I think this team is going to have potential straight off the bat. I may even go to say they may go like 7-9. Like, I don't predict a winning season, but 7-9 seems reasonable. Anyway, that's kind of off track. The last wide receiver on this list is Sammy Watkins, who, by all accounts, this was the best performance by far that he had in the regular season because everything else afterwards was not even close. He had 9 receptions for 198 yards and 3 touchdowns against the Jaguars, where they won 40-26. And from that point on, Sammy Watkins was kind of an afterthought. We all know the Chiefs' offense last year was a little bit wishy-washy as far as who was the top dogs. Well, besides Travis Kelce, of course. But, Patrick Mahomes was kind of banged up. We know about everybody else on the offense was a little bit banged up, including their top flight wide receiver, of course, and everything else involved. But, they still ended up winning championships, so it doesn't matter. We know what they're capable of and what they have proven thus far. Now we're moving on to the top rushers. Marlon Mack, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Dalvin Cook, Mark Ingram. Now, Mark Ingram had a really nice season for the Baltimore Ravens, and he's always somebody who's always been on my radar as a solid running back, too. In fantasy football, I had him a few years ago, of course, when he played for the Saints, and the Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram train was in full effect, and I was fully on board, chew. And then I had Marlon Mack last year, and this was a real test here that I was like, yes, Marlon Mack, he's gonna get it done. I'm ready for this. Let's go. And then injuries, things just didn't work out for Indianapolis, who is actually we're going to be talking about really soon. But Marlon Mack, he cooled off very much. Christian McCaffrey never cooled off. He just got even better. Even without Cam Newton last year, he just got even more special. Saquon, of course, we know he had a bit of an injury bug, and then their offensive line was not the greatest. Things happen, and Dalvin Cook really showcased what he's capable of, although he also has some injury issues as well in Minnesota, and which is why a lot of people predict that Minnesota has been kind of tiptoeing around the needing to pay him top running back money right now, because we just don't know what his health is looking like. And then just to round this whole thing off, we have week 1 top passers for 2019 was Lamar Jackson, who had a game buster week 1 against Miami. Then Dak Prescott. Remember when we thought Dak Prescott was ascending into a level that we never thought he would, and then he cooled off? Remember that? Then Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson, then Marcus Mariota. So take week 1 with a grain of salt like we take preseason with a grain of salt. Things change. The NFL changes each week. Things look different. People have different looks. And please, defenses, don't assume that somebody's defense is going to be top tier in weeks 1, 2, and 3, and that means they're going to be top tier for the rest of the season. Things change. Offenses know how to scheme better. Defenses know how to scheme better. We will never know what's going to happen with defenses specifically, though. So just wait it out. But we're going to take our first break here at the GSMC, and we'll be back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we're back here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. And before we were talking about the fact that there's no preseason this year for 2020. And now we are moving on to week 1 of 2020 at the very start of our fantasy season. So we don't have to slime and drag through and feel sluggish watching football for a solid month before we get the real deal nitty gritty action. So now we're going to be talking about a few teams, one NFC, one AFC. We're going to start with the NFC first, and then we'll move on to the next segment that covers the AFC team I wanted to discuss. So the NFC team is close and near and dear to my heart for the most part. Sometimes they break it too often. Sometimes I leave the regular season thinking that I have hope, and then the hope comes crashing down in a round 1 loss that I never predicted to lose in said ways, or even a second round loss to where I never predicted we'd lose in said ways. But we're talking about the New Orleans Saints. They're my personal favorite team, but I have no biases here because this is fantasy football, and in fantasy football there is no home field or home team advantage per se. So let's go ahead and get right into it. What do people project the top fantasy offensive players on the Saints to be as far as rankings? So Jamie Eisenberg from CBS Fantasy projects Drew Brees as quarterback 11. David Richard predicts quarterback 7 for Drew Brees, and Heath Cummings projects him as quarterback 11. Alvin Kamara is basically running back 3. David Richard has him as running back 4, but everybody else has him at running back 3. Latavius Murray is kind of in a range of 42 through 52. Michael Thomas is undisputed wide receiver number 1 in all different facets of the game. Emmanuel Sanders is wide receiver 50. And, well, he's through 45 through 56. And Jarrett Cook basically is tight end 15. And the Saints defense is between 10 and 19. I'm sorry, it's between 10 and 9. So, I'm sorry, it's between 5 and 10. They have 5, 9, and 10. Couldn't see there. So, projections wise, they think that Drew Brees from Heath Cummings thinks that Drew Brees will have about 4,472 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. And 30 touchdowns, this is some pretty high numbers coming out of Drew Brees' camp, considering that he is pretty old and he's getting to the point to where he is at his twilight of his career. Alvin Kamara is being predicted to have a little bit under 1,000 yards rushing, 9 touchdowns, 86 receiving yards, 731 receiving yards. 86 receptions, 731 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. Latavius Murray is about 600 yards rushing with 5 touchdowns, 31 receptions for 200 yards and 1 TD. Michael Thomas is looking at 164 targets with 130 receptions, 1,500 yards and 9 touchdowns. Emmanuel Sanders is looking at 79 targets with 58 receptions for 764 yards and 5 TDs. Traequan Smith here with 40 targets, 27 receptions, 369 yards, 5 touchdowns. And then they have Jarrett Cook with 74 targets, 47 receptions, 631 yards, and 4 TDs. They have the biggest question being with Alvin Kamara, will he be able to bounce back from his injury-riddled 2019? So, a high ankle sprain cost Alvin Kamara 2 games and sapped him from some explosiveness once he returned, which impacted his receiving yardage more than anything. But much of Kamara's 2019 stat line looked fine. His rushing efficiency and yards were yards were normal. Plus, he caught 81 balls for the 3rd straight year. Touchdowns were the biggest culprit for his down season, as Kamara scored just 6 times after 31 across his first 2 seasons. That's unlikely to stick, and Kamara is a trustworthy round 1 pick. Now, here's a sleeper for the Saints that they're providing here that I'm also going to provide another one, where Latavius Murray, there's 2 spot running back, basically, running back 2 in their offense. He acquitted himself as Kamara's handcuff while the lead back missed some time, of course, and he returns for his age 30 season. So Latavius Murray will be 30 by the time this season will kick off. And his draft cost at the time right now makes him a worthwhile bench running back. And there aren't many, if any, offenses more prolific in terms of generating running back fantasy points. And if some of the Saints' offensive scores shift back towards running backs in 2020, Murray could find himself some standalone value. There aren't many good explanations on how late Murray goes, other than that he's unexciting, older player. So you may need to take advantage of that. They're saying their breakout player is Alvin Kamara, which I guess in a sense makes sense because the Saints are a top-heavy offense where sometimes the term breakout can be hard to put into words for them or tag a player on to the word. But Kamara is already an established star, so it wouldn't be surprising to see him produce a career season in 2020, despite reported knee, ankle, and back injuries costing him 2 games and sapping his explosiveness. Kamara caught 81 balls for the 3rd straight year in 2019. His receptions per game, though, have risen each year, and Kamara has potential to crest triple digits in a healthy 16-game season. That type of receiving role, along with what would likely be his first career 200 carry season and reversion back to his pre-2019 touchdown production, would give Kamara the closest statistical profile to Christian McCaffrey in the league, which makes sense because they are basically the same player as far as skill set. It's just that Christian McCaffrey had a production year that I don't think anybody, including himself, will ever be able to replicate. And Kamara was just kind of down bad last year, and I felt that a lot of people kind of looked at that as maybe this is who he is, but I think that we have to look at the bigger picture here and see where the Saints were at the time. And there's a lot of things that happened with that offense that things were a little bit shaky in the beginning, and they just never really caught up to it near the tail end. Jarrett Cook at tight end is supposedly their bust potential player, because throwing in Emmanuel Sanders in the team here could also be a bust too, but Cook goes higher in drafts because he's a tight end, and tight ends typically there aren't that many good and quality to draft in fantasy. They're hard to come by. So he caught just 43 balls in 2019 and only finished well in fantasy thanks to 9 touchdowns, and that was his first season with more than 5 scores in his career. And he also dealt with concussions and watched as New Orleans drafted Adam Trautman as his heir apparent in the 3rd round in the 2020 NFL draft. Meanwhile, Cook bested his previous career high of 9.4 yards per target by a substantial margin, finishing with 10.8. His efficiency was due to regress across the board, though. A big reason Cook saw just 65 targets is how difficult it is for the secondary players to produce consistent fantasy lines in the offense that revolves around Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara. We did see in 2019 how more opportunity can come up when one of those two players, in Kamara's case, isn't fully healthy, but Sanders joining the mix for auxiliary touches and it's hard to imagine either veteran on the wrong side of 30 being a consistent fantasy option unless things go very wrong in New Orleans. Now, I understand the concern for Jarrett Cook, but I really do feel like if you watch the team and you put the stats aside for a little bit, you could see that Drew Brees really was looking at Jarrett Cook extensively near the second half when Drew Brees actually came back and they were building chemistry. And even in that playoff game where he did end up getting a concussion and was taken out of it, it was a really, really good showing that Jarrett Cook was really dominating in that game. And I think that he is somebody who the Saints are going to use pretty extensively throughout the season. Now, I'm not saying he's going to usurp Michael Thomas as being their number one option. Of course, it's insane. Why break something that isn't broken? So, of course, they're still going to go to Michael Thomas. Of course, they're still going to look at Alvin Kamara as being the second breadwinner in that offense. But I do think that Jarrett Cook, with the feeling that he had with Drew Brees, is something that Sean Payton paid attention to. It's something that Drew Brees paid attention to. And I think that unless there is some really, really big time drop off within production and confidence and performance, I don't see why Jarrett Cook wouldn't be the third option in that offense. Now, I understand Emmanuel Sanders is a extreme upgrade from where their wide receivers were beforehand, right? Of course, we know that he lost Ted Ginn, but he wasn't what he was even 2 years ago. So I don't see that as a knock. I just think that means there's more weapons across the board that will get their actual weapons even better chances of making a play. So having Emmanuel Sanders there is really good, and I think he'll have a solid stat line, but I don't believe that it's going to hinder Jarrett Cook in any sort of fashion. Now, the sleeper on this team by far has been the sleeper on this team since he's been in the league, and that's Traequan Smith, because a lot of people still believe Traequan Smith has the talent and the skill set to be a quality rotational wide receiver within an offense. And it's really tough when you look across the board and look at his numbers, because he really isn't somebody who has wowed the stat line in many times. And his contemporaries, this is his 3rd season, and usually this is the time where we find out whether or not somebody is going to break out or not. And I think this is make it or break it time for Traequan Smith, and he really needs to showcase what he has to offer, because Emmanuel Sanders is no spring chicken, right? We know this for sure. So if Traequan wants a continued spot on his offense, or at least wants to showcase to other people that he is somebody of value, he has to do it now. And I think that Drew Brees has always had confidence in him. He throws him the ball well enough, and he's put him into situations where he has to make a big play, and he's come down with some big catches over his career. And, of course, not everything has been peaches and cream as far as the Saints offense when times have mattered, but Traequan Smith has shown flashes of what he can be. And maybe this is the homer in me this time. Maybe this is the one time where I'm like, Traequan Smith can do it because he's a Saint. But I do feel like there is a chance for Traequan Smith to showcase some game that may have always been there. It just has, the opportunity has never always arisen because the Saints offense is in fact a two-party system of Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara for the strongest part. But there's always that third guy, and I think the third guy is going to be Jarrett Cook, and the potential guy who may end up showing some fantasy value in like deeper drafts, and guys who are just looking to have value over anything and upside. Don't fall asleep on Traequan Smith. And last but not least, we have to talk about Drew Brees as quarterback, only because last year he did get hurt, and he is 40-something years old, man. He's getting old, and this is going to be one of his last few seasons left. And we don't know what he'll look like coming out of week one. It's not like he sits there and does preseason very often anyway. So it's not like pitchers need to get ready to go and have to go through the whole spring games and training camp and all that. Drew Brees is a seasoned veteran. He'll be able to be ready, but we just don't know what level of Drew Brees we are going to receive this year. And that's always something that we have to take into account as far as fantasy production. Now, if you can find a better quarterback sometime in like rounds 9 or 10, then maybe it's time to go ahead. But remember, you always want to draft for value rather than position. And you shouldn't stress about having to get someone like a Drew Brees, because in reality, his fantasy performances the last few years have not been what you remember them to be back in the day when it was Drew Brees throwing for 500 yards a game just to try and get the team over the hump to win. But we're going to take another break, and we're going to talk about our AFC team on what we see coming out in 2020. And that AFC team is going to be the Colts. So buckle up, stay tuned. We'll be right back here at the GSMC.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, where we were talking about the Saints' offensive potential. Last time we discussed whether or not maybe Jarrett Cook is not who we think he is, or who I think he is at least, and that is a guy who could be a solid third option in the offense as far as fantasy production, as others have said that he might actually be a bust. Same thing with Emmanuel Sanders possibly being a bust as well. And we talked a little bit about Traequan Smith as well, and how I feel like he might end up finding some value in deeper draft leagues, or deeper leagues in general of 14 plus people. He may be somebody that you need to look at, because he is in his third year, and that's typically where people bang or bust as far as what they will be in the NFL. So with that said, we are going to be moving onward into a new discussion of an AFC team, with similar parameters and such. We are going to be talking about the Indianapolis Colts. So there's a lot of things new about the Colts as far as who they've got in the draft, who they got in free agency, the whole nine. So, of course, we know Phillip Rivers is now on the Colts. So, of course, the last-minute retirement of Andrew Luck threw the Colts' 2019 season into disarray, but it was pivoted about as well as you could hope for in the offseason with the addition of Phillip Rivers. And Rivers is closer to his final full-body heave down the field than his first, but he should help revive the fantasy career of T.Y. Hilton, which Ticker is figuring out, or was Tricky is figuring out, what the Colts are going to be doing with their running backs, and that's the biggest thing. Their record last year was 7-9. They averaged 22.6 points per game. They had 327 yards per game, and they passed for 194 and rushed for 133. Their rush attempts were about 29 per game, which was 5th in the league, while their pass attempts were 32, which was 24th in the league. So right now, we have to remember their quarterback is Phillip Rivers. They do have Jacoby Brissett still as quarterback number 2. Marlon Mack is there. Nyheim Hines was there. Zach Pascal was somebody whose name popped up a bit. Eric Ebron is no longer there, so it's just Jake Doyle. So here's what we have to know right now and what we can perceive what the 2020 season will probably come to, because here's what we know. So T.Y. Hilton's average depth of target was a career low in 2019. From 2014 through 2017, his average depth of target ranged from 12.2 to 14. Some of that could have been due to Jacoby Brissett, but Hilton's second lowest mark came in 2018. Hilton has only topped 82 receptions once in his career and has never scored more than 7 touchdowns. If he is not consistently earning opportunities down the field, there's really no path for him to being a top 15 wide receiver anymore. So in the 2020 offseason, of course, they drafted quite a bit of talent. So they have Michael Pittman Jr. from the second round, Jonathan Taylor in the second round, Julian Blackmon as a safety. They drafted Jacob Eason, which is interesting. They have another wide receiver, Desmond Patman, from the 6th round. And they also drafted a guard in Danny Pinter in the 5th. So we know about Phillip Rivers being an addition, DeForest Buckner in the defensive tackle. They got Trey Burton from the Bears, and they got Xavier Rhodes. So what is that worth? What does that mean? Well, the quarterback projections for their team is kind of up in the air. Phillip Rivers is looking like he's going to be around quarterback 20 to 26. Jonathan Taylor is looking like he is going to be running back. Some people have him as high as 20 and as low as 28. Nyheim Hines is about as high as 39 to 47. And Marlon Mack is about as high as 38 to 48. So people are not really as high on Marlon Mack, and it seems that Jonathan Taylor is going to be the guy who a lot of people are going to draft if they are looking at the Colts offense from a running perspective. T.Y. is looking like on the outside of wide receiver 20, with more likely he'll be in between 20 and 24. Michael Pittman, some people don't know where to rank him. Some people say he's wide receiver 51. He's a guy who I'm looking intensely on as a potential rookie breakout guy. And I don't mean breakout as in he'll have 1,000 yards, but I think he will be somebody to keep your eye on because he's a bigger receiver and big targets help quarterbacks tremendously. Then there's Jake Doyle, who's seemingly around tight end 14 to tight end 17. And there we go. Let's look at some projections potentially. So Phillip Rivers looks like a projection of 4,000 yards with 27 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. Jonathan Taylor, the rookie, is projecting a little bit under 1,000 yards with 6 touchdowns, 12 receptions for 82 yards and 1 touchdown. So not a lot of pass catching out of him. Marlon Mack, he's looking like 700 yards rushing with 6 touchdowns, 4 receptions, and 34 yards, no touchdowns. So even less receptions. And Nyheim Hines is looking at 165 yards and 2 touchdowns rushing, and 59 receptions for 430 yards and 3 touchdowns. So the running back by committee scheme is looking like that's what is going to be taking on here in Indianapolis. And that could just mean a whole lot of different things, because we know Marlon Mack hasn't been the healthiest back in the world. Jonathan Taylor is the new bell cow, the new fresh face that potentially could be the guy who might be a bell cow for them. I think they really like Nyheim Hines in the role that he is in currently, and that could have some value for deeper draft leagues. But honestly, their running backs aren't the things that I'm really worried about too much as far as who am I looking at, because we kind of know that running backs by committees are not always cut and dry, and we don't know exactly what we're getting. The wide receivers, though, are something that we do have to look at. They're projecting T.Y. to have 129 targets with 81 receptions for 1,162 yards and 6 touchdowns, while Michael Pittman will have 73 targets, 44 receptions, 612 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Zach Pascal is looking like 62 targets, 37 receptions, and 500 yards with 3 touchdowns. Jake Doyle with 84 targets, 55 receptions, 569 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So what is the biggest question, of course, is will Jonathan Taylor lead the backfield in carries in 2020? You know, Marlon Mack is on his final year of his rookie deal, and the Colts have selected a potential future workhorse in Jonathan Taylor in the second round of the draft. So Taylor blew up the combine with a 4.39 40-yard dash, and at 226 pounds, he has averaged more than 2,000 yards rushing across 3 seasons at Wisconsin. Nyheim Hines figures to maintain his pass-catching role, but Taylor can still have a huge rookie season behind the Colts' plus offensive line if he can overtake Marlon Mack for early down work. So now we look at their sleepers and breakouts and potential busts. So they say that a sleeper on the Colts is Jake Doyle. So Jake Doyle hasn't posted a top 10 season since 2017, but with Eric Ebron gone, he should have great opportunity. In 2019, the Colts' 29% tight ends and target rate was the 4th highest in the league, and they averaged 154 targets per year to the position in 2 seasons under Frank Reich. And Rivers has a long history of targeting the position, and Doyle should be way ahead of Burton and Mo Alley Cox in the pecking order. So Doyle is available in the double-digit rounds in every draft. That has been done for mocks, of course. Breakout is a little bit surprising here to read, but Nyheim Hines is the breakout guy potentially. So as Austin Eckler will tell you, there are more than enough room for pass-catching backs in an offense with Rivers playing quarterback. Hines has a 70-catch upside in 2020 and should set career highs in total yards and touchdowns as well. And expect more volume and better efficiency as Hines produces solid flex numbers at worst in PPR. The upside isn't as high as what we saw from Austin Eckler last year, but it's well inside the top 20 in PPR. And their bust, which is interesting to me, is Jonathan Taylor. So they say, yes, Jonathan Taylor should be the breakout pick. Unfortunately, his ADP makes him much more likely to be a bust candidate. He's being drafted in the 3rd round ahead of backs like Le'Veon Bell, Chris Carson, and James Conner. While Taylor may be more talented than those veterans, he's unlikely to earn 60% of their touches. Taylor is an incredible talent who could one day be a top 5 back in this league, but he's inexperienced as a pass catcher and was a bit of an adventure when he was asked to handle pass blocking in college. He is going to share early down work with Marlon Mack and with Mack, as he has virtually no chance to take a large share of the running back targets early in the year. Taylor will start the league as a 10 to 12 touch trap back, and unless he breaks a few long runs, he'll be cheaper in October when he is in August. Pass on him on draft day and wait a month into the season and start making offers. So what these guys are saying basically is to get him during the draft, you're just going to overpay. And it's not to say that he won't have value. Of course, when he does start to play and when the league does kick off and say we're in week 6, his value may start to grow a bit more. But if somebody who pays for him early and the 3rd round, or even maybe in the 2nd round, somebody is trying to jump on somebody, which would be crazy, it would behoove people, if you're still interested and you just didn't want to take him in the draft, to maybe look for some offers. And you probably need to hope and pray that Marlon Mack starts doing some real damage, and then we'll see where Jonathan Taylor's production and projections for the rest of the season will lie. But I think one sleeper that I'd like to add, of course, is Michael Pittman. The kid is huge, right? Michael Pittman Jr. is a guy who really did show some flashes at his time at USC. And I'm not saying that this guy is going to end up being like the next Michael Thomas, right? But what I am saying is that he does look like he is going to be a real great target guy in the league. A good reception, a good secure catch wide receiver who catches in between the numbers and can really do some damage like a Michael Thomas. So he's 6'4", 223. That's a big guy. He's going to be a big physical wide receiver. He's going to fend off press coverage and high point passes for contested receptions and will be willing to throw key blocks. He sounds like a good dude. The assistant general manager, Ed Dodds, always presses us to watch more and watch more film. And Colts offensive coordinator Nick Sirianni said in a recent Zoom call conference he was talking about that. And I think that a lot of people are looking at what he was able to do in college, which, you know, he had 101 catches for 1,275 yards and 11 touchdowns as a senior. So he is an older guy, a little bit comparative to everybody else, but the plan is to have him at playing the X wide receiver spot, which means he can line up solo on the outside with other receivers or stacked on the opposite side. And the idea is to isolate the rookie on man-to-man coverage to provide him opportunities to make plays. So if they're looking for him to make plays, he may be somebody who could be more akin to Andre Johnson, like a bigger wide receiver. The framework makes sense, and I'm interested to take him. Now, I'm not saying they should jump on him in the 3rd round or anything like that, but a lot of people have him as wide receiver 51 or in the 50s. He's definitely going to have some value. You may find him cheap. You may find him in the 6th round. If he's there, you got to take him in the 6th round. That's for me. If I really look at it, if we're looking upside or maybe in the 7th round, that's where I'm targeting him. So that's just my little tidbits. If I'm looking for him, which I am, I've been high on the Colts offense for some time. And I think now it all is starting to paint a beautiful picture for me to see who and why I'm targeting certain people. So there we have it. So a lot of people are saying to maybe hold and press on the brakes for Jonathan Taylor, even though it seemed that we basically buried our love for the Mac man, the Mac truck, the return of the Mac. He was literally dug in a grave and put down to rest by many fantasy owners and fans. So now it may be time to pump the brakes on that whole ideology. And I would tend to agree. Pump the brakes. But we're going to take another break and we're going to come back with our final segment of the day. So keep rocking with us. Stay tuned and hold on to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Okay, fantasy football fans, we are back here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and we are doing the last segment of the day. Yes, I know, temper the emotions. We'll get through it. We'll be back next week after this, but fear not. We have a really good segment to end off the day, and it comes from an interesting article I read from Pro Football Focus, and they're talking about what are the chances of multiple players balling out in the same offense in one season. So this was written by Ian Hartez, rather, and it's an interesting article, so I think everyone should go check it out for themselves. But he says that there's a common concern in fantasy football land surrounding how many players from the same team is too many when constructing a roster. You know, stacking a quarterback with a wide receiver or tight end is fairly commonplace, but things get a little more unknown when we consider multiple wide receivers or running backs from the same team. God forbid an offense has a higher end wide receiver, running back, and tight end, but strangely no quarterback. So he says that we'll attempt to quantify just how often we should expect different sets of teammates to function as high end fantasy performers. So defining them as single season top 12 PPR finishers at quarterback and tight end, as well as top 24 producers at running back and wide receiver since 2010. There are 720 instances of a quarterback 1, running back 1 or 2, wide receiver 1 or 2, or tight end 1 over the past 10 years occurred on a total of 300 teams. The following positional builds have occurred most frequently. Note that a single position build means that no other teammate at a non-listed position achieve their defined high-end fantasy production. So just running backs alone was 48. Running back wide receiver combo was 47. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end was done 20 times. Wide receiver was done 18 times. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver was done 18 times. Running back, tight end was done 14 times. Running back, tight end, wide receiver was done 12 times. Tight end was done 11 times. Quarterback, running back was done 9 times. Tight end, wide receiver was done 9 times. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver was done 9 times. And quarterback, wide receiver, tight end was done 9 times. So there's a lot to unpack, of course, but most of the key takeaways can be described in 4 main points. First point is the idea that multiple high-end pass catchers should go hand in hand with fantasy QB1s appears to hold true. So there's 48 of 120 fantasy quarterbacks that boast at least one top 24 wide receiver and a top 12 tight end over the past 10 seasons. This includes 3 of their top 12 builds, so quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and 20, quarterback, running back, wide receiver that has 9, and quarterback, wide receiver, tight end at 9. The trend applies to 25% of the top 12 quarterbacks, according to the writer, which is Patrick Mahomes, Tom Brady, and Drew Brees. It's all worth noting that both Tyrod Taylor and Ryan Fitzpatrick enter fantasy-friendly situations. They should be capable of exploiting for however long they can hold on to their respective jobs, and the writer is also probably a bit too low on Jared Goff based on the logic. The next point here is high-end fantasy running backs have usually come without an accompanying high-end fantasy quarterback. So a large percentage, 58 percentile, have come on teams without a top-performing quarterback 1. So that includes the 2 most common overall builds, solo running back with 48 and running back wide receiver with 47. The trend applies to 63% of the top 24 backs in rankings. So that's Christian McCaffrey, Saquon, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb, Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, James Conner, Melvin Gordon, David Montgomery, Leonard Fournette, Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, and Jonathan Taylor to round it all out. There he goes again, Jonathan Taylor, right? But there was a whole lot of different names out there. So the writer still remains particularly bullish on Austin Eckler's potential to thrive in 2020, even though Phillip Rivers isn't under center, and there's simply too much talent there for him to be a dud in either the pass or run game. So the next point is high-end fantasy wide receivers haven't necessarily needed an equally amazing quarterback. So, for fantasy rather, overall 103 of 240 wide receivers have been on teams without a fantasy quarterback one. And we see this play out in two of the top four most common builds, so running back, wide receiver, and solo wide receiver. This trend applies to 63% of the top 24 wide receivers to his list. Devontae Adams, Julio Jones, Adam Thielen, Allen Robinson, A.J. Brown, Robert Woods, Calvin Ridley, Juju Smith-Schuster, Odell Beckham, DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, DJ Shark, Devontae Parker, Courtland Sutton, and T.Y. Hilton. Volume concerns are the highest for guys like Brown, Ridley, OBJ, and Sutton, although each have demonstrated the sort of talent and past production to continue to warrant high-end inclusion. And don't be afraid to go after talented alpha wide receivers, even though the situations under center aren't the brightest, particularly in the case of A.J. Brown. So, next is that tight ends can be meh. Tight ends can end up being a below average quarterback's best friend. So specifically 53 out of 120 tight end ones since 2010 have functioned without a top 12 quarterback. The rate is nearly identical to that of wide receiver 1 and 2 without a quarterback one. And while quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end is the most frequent build for a tight end position, the running back tight end build, which is 14, and the solo tight end, which is 11, have also been top 8 overall constructions. So like wide receiver, the writer is perhaps a bit too high on this trend, as 58% of the top 12 tight ends on his list qualify. So George Kittle, Evan Ingram, Tyler Higbee, Hunter Henry, Darren Waller, Noah Fant, and Mike Gillespie. Late round options like Blake Jarvin and TJ Hawkinson, while in crowded offenses, perhaps deserve enhanced consideration. So now that we have a better idea of some of the more common builds for each position, still one of the main questions we want answered is the frequency in which a team employs multiple high-end fantasy performers at the same position. And the answer is not all that often. Quarterback, there are 0 instances of 2 top 12 fantasy performers on the same team, obviously. And at running back, there's been 18 instances of 2 top 24 fantasy performers on the same team. Wide receiver has been 43 instances. Tight end has had 2. On average, we've seen about 1.8 instances of a team employing 2 high-end fantasy running backs in the same season. And the writer doesn't presently have any duo inside of the top 24 backs currently, although Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, as well as Melvin Ingram and J.K. Dobbins, can come close, as they are Melvin Ingram. Oh, wow. There's too many M.I.s and Marks and Melvins, but Mark Ingram is running back 26 and J.K. Dobbins is 31. So they're kind of close, and Nick Chubb is running back 11, while Kareem Hunt is running back 27 this year as far as rankings are concerned to this guy. And the wide receiver room has been the most fantasy-friendly group in terms of multiple teammates balling out together during the same season. So overall, we've seen an average of 4.3 instances of a single season or a single team employing 2 top 24 PPR wide receivers in a season since 2010. And note that 74% of these teams also included a fantasy quarterback one. The current rankings denote Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley, as well as Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in this year's qualifiers, while the likes of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, Juju Smith and Deontay Johnson are close to qualifying. So the potential emerges for both Juju and Johnson with a healthy version of Ben Roethlisberger is plenty possible, considering the reality that both Smith-Schuster and Antonio Brown had 160 plus targets during their respective wide receiver 1 seasons back in 2018, and Johnson is objectively a baller. So the only time we've seen multiple high-end tight ends was in the 2019 Eagles, Zach Ertz, tight end 4, and Dallas Goedert, tight end 10, and the 2011 Patriots with Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez, and is likely to take multiple injuries again for the Eagles wide receivers in 2020 for the tight ends to replicate that feat. and don't count on this happening again anytime soon. So finally, a look at the 4 quick fantasy-friendly combinations that were literally not seen more than twice over the past decade. So quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver was only done once. And that was the 2013 Denver Broncos, which is objectively the most fantasy-friendly offense in the last decade. So Peyton Manning as quarterback number 1, Noshawn Moreno as running back 4, Demaryius Thomas as wide receiver 1, Eric Decker as wide receiver 9, Wes Welker as wide receiver 21, and Julius Thomas as tight end 3, average an absurd 37.9 real life points per game. Like, not fantasy, real life points per game. And then running back was there was only one in 2016 with the Jets, were the only offense to boast 2 high-end backs without literally any other high-end fantasy contributors. So both Matt Forte was running back 21 and Banal Powell was running back 17. And they both provided enough dual threat ability to make the last version of Shane Galley's defense or offense in the Jets a fun one. Then there was 2 quarterbacks instances, or quarterback was 2 instances where the 2016 Jaguars and the 2017 Washington team are the only 2 instances of a offense employing a top 12 fantasy quarterback without any other high-end fantasy talent. So Blake Bortles split production up fairly evenly between Allen Robinson, Marquise Lee, and Allen Hurns, while Julius Thomas' injury and committee backfield may enhance volume for anyone a no-go. Kirk Cousins deployed a similar strategy in the likes of Jamison Crowder, Chris Thompson, Vernon Davis, Ryan Grant, and Josh Doctson. All gained over 500 yards, but fewer than 800. A committee backfield and an injured Jordan Reed left the rest of the offense without much fantasy upside. And then finally, running back, tight end, wide receiver was done twice. The 2013 Bears and the 2017 Vikings were the only offenses to employ high-end fantasy running back, tight end, and 2 wide receivers without a high-end fantasy quarterback, 1. And this was largely due to injuries in both cases, as neither Jay Cutler nor Case Keenum played a full 16-game season. So there are exceptions to every rule, and records are made to be broken. With that said, but be careful when assessing an offense's viability and enabling multiple high-end fantasy options. So there are times and scenarios that can be comfortably utilized, but don't confuse a recent outlier as a new found trend. So I just thought that article was really well done and really well written. So I would encourage everyone to go check that one out. If they do so, please. That's again written by Ian Hartees and on Pro Football Focus. So that's going to be the wrap up for the Fantasy Football Podcast here at the GSMC. I hope everybody had a good time here as much as I did. And we'll be going towards finishing up the 32 teams fantasy offensive potential as we will move on to another NFC and another AFC team next Friday, along with many other interesting topics as we see the NFL season start to show some worth here, man. We're starting to see some things move in a positive direction for the NFL 2020 season. As remember, there is no preseason anymore. We start in week 1, and let's not forget that there might be some chances of guys opting out of the season. So if you already got your draft going and you're not in a dynasty league, hold on, because there might be some big time decisions that are happening underneath our noses every second of every day. So make sure you're reading up on your articles, make sure you're doing your research, and don't forget to enjoy some fantasy football news and discussions at all times. Have fun. Remember, this is all about fun. So with that said, it's the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I'd like to remind you all and encourage everyone, please go rate, review, and write a good comment or a bad one. Doesn't matter. If you like me or you don't, leave a comment, leave a review on the podcast on whatever platform you listen to us. It does us a great deal of service. And don't forget to follow our social media, our Facebook and our Twitter at GSMC Fantasy football. So for GSMC, this is Ethan signing off, and I'll see you all next week. Keep playing fantasy football, people.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.